Okay, good morning, everyone. Everyone was so responsive. You got quiet so quickly. Thank you. Good morning. I'm Joe Ruffalo. I'm the general manager for The Hill. We'd like to thank everyone for coming this morning, both in person and online, for our event today, Nuclear Frontier, Securing America's Energy Future. I'd like to thank our sponsor, the nuclear company, for hosting and sponsoring this important conversation. We're here today because America's energy future is shining a little brighter after the recent passage of the Bipartisan Advance Act to bolster U.S. nuclear power production. The new law seeks to broaden how America generates power, creating a more resilient infrastructure to meet the surging energy demands driven by data centers, electric vehicles, and reshored factories. Of course, the law isn't without critics or competition. Concerns have been raised about potential safety issues and challenges related to nuclear waste. On the flip side, there are those who worry that the newest law doesn't go nearly far enough to match China's 27 nuclear reactors currently under development. The question now is, where do we go from here? But before we get underway, just a few housekeeping issues. If you are in the room, please silence your phones, but we do encourage you to join online in the conversation there. You can follow us on Facebook, X, and Instagram at The Hill using the hashtag #TheHillEnergy. And with that, I'm delighted to introduce our first segment featuring our very own Bob Cusack, the editor-in-chief of The Hill. He's joined by special guest, the Honorable Mark Menezes, former Deputy Secretary of Energy and the current President and Chief Executive Officer of the United States Energy Association. Welcome.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks for everyone who's come this morning. Mark, you've worked in the energy sector for 3 decades.
Thanks for reminding me.
Yeah, well, I've been here 3 decades too. So, private sector, law, lobbying, as well as within government. What have you learned from those experiences and applied to your current role?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, it's great to be here with you, Bob, and thank you for having me. And it's great to see so many former colleagues and friends in the audience. And it truly is remarkable to me to see this enthusiasm at this time of the morning on the topic of energy. So that is one thing that I learned, is that energy is very important, and it certainly drives all the economies. And we know that on the global stage, countries need energy for their independence and, of course, their security and economic prosperity. So we realize that here in the U.S., but also globally. So that's been a hallmark. People tend to forget that energy really provides almost all of the needs, that we have as people. So that's why it's so dynamic. That's why this room is probably filled this morning. And I've learned different things when you're on the Hill. You do have to put together policies that, as we see sort of in the pending permitting bill, things everybody doesn't get everything. So the art of developing energy policy, is that you get rooms full of smart people like we have here today, get their views, get their inputs, and try to help drive policy. I think Maria's going to talk about a success story on that when she talks about, the recently enacted nuclear legislation.
What are your current priorities, and specifically as it relates to talk about international challenges, specifically China?
Yeah, well, that's another great question that you have. And China is really is driving so much in the world today with its huge demand. We know that on the climate stage, their emissions can certainly offset all of the reductions of all the countries, certainly offset the U.S. emissions. Their demand is important. Their innovation is important. Their production levels are important. We import a lot of their products. And yet, it's important that we in America be able to develop our supply chains. I think an important lesson learned out of COVID is that you have to have your own independent supply chains, because while globalization served its purposes, I've been around a long time, I know the globalization efforts, we thought that would really help make the globe smaller. We could outsource a lot. We could be a bigger community. Trade would be important. It'd minimize the chances of wars, all of that. And yet what we've seen is, when you look in the energy space, we've outsourced a lot of our the energy needs that we have, both in production and importantly, the supply chains. And it took something like COVID to wake up and to say, wow, how independent are we? And all countries ask that question. So you see that going around globally, which is now why I think that the role for USEA, just to get around to the question that you asked, our mission is today what it was 100 years ago when we were actually established. We were established as part of the World Energy Council, which at that time saw a need to ensure that there was going to be global access to energy so that all countries could have access to it, it could be affordable, and it could be, back then, reliable. And that mission continues today. And when you look forward in the energy space, you see for the future, we're looking at all of these emission reduction plans, and they kind of run out to 2050. But when you look out to 2100, by 2050, we're going to have another, according to the UN, another billion people in the world, and possibly by 2100, another billion. So an additional 2 billion people on Earth, and they will all demand energy. It's coming from, the developing countries in Southeast Asia and India and parts of Africa. USEA is in all those places. And so we are trying to bring access to energy. We're trying to have their electricity systems independent from Russia. We're in Latin America, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe. So these are our mission is what we do today.
What are the biggest challenges facing the industry?
It continues to be permitting. I'll be honest. It's, we're an organization that supports all of the above. And whether you're looking at building renewables in the developing Southeast Asia countries, or whether or not you're building infrastructure to carry natural gas pipeline to replace coal someplace, it all takes infrastructure. And it doesn't really matter what it is because everything is local, and it might impact the way the local community operates. It might impact view sheds. It changes the way of life. So permitting, whether it's in the United States or frankly any country. And when I joined USEA, I asked our seasoned veterans, I said, well, what lessons have you learned that you'd like to impart to me? And they said, you have to get community buy-in from everything that we do. You can't, as U.S., you can't show up in a developing country or any country, and same thing in the United States. You can't show up and say, we have a great energy project for you, and it's going to really help you solve your problems. And they're burning biomass, inside of, their homes, and we can see the health effects. But for them, they have been doing this for generations. Mm-hmm. And they don't know any other thing. And traditions are developed around that. That's their lifestyle. And it's been around. So you can't go in and go, here's a great propane tank. And by the way, we've got the infrastructure just to get them off of burning dung and biomass. But you've got to build capacity. You've got to convince them. You've got to change their way of life for generations. That's the challenge. And again, so that continues to be, frankly, the biggest problem.
Many energy issues are not bipartisan, and the ADVANCE Act did not get a lot of headlines. The Hill wrote about it, but it wasn't like on the front page of the Washington Post. That was a bipartisan bill signed into law by President Biden. Talk about the bipartisan aspect, because that seems to be increasing. As Joe mentioned, there are always going to be critics of any legislation, but overwhelmingly bipartisan bill. Where do you see that trend going and helping the industry?
That's a great question. And again, we've seen the bipartisanship come together with the IIJA and with, back to the Competes Act and the ADVANCE Act. So bipartisanship is still possible. It may not be I wouldn't say, nothing is easy on the Hill, but back in 2005, many people know I was associated with the Energy Policy Act back then. There was an opportunity really to kind of go to the center. So now we see issues have to come together, like, let's just say, with nuclear, for example. There are way more supporters of nuclear now than there were back in the day when people thought about, 3 Mile Island, and then Fukushima happened, and that kind of thing. But today, with the increase in demand and with Sam Altman's quip, about we need more electricity to power AI that we're all going to be dependent on, and throws out fusion, and you see capital flowing. Capital is not partisan. Capital flowing into private companies to develop fusion. And that ties in with, while at DOE you're developing these technologies, fusion had always been in the science office, not in the nuclear energy office. That's how much of it was, sort of always 30 years out. But today there's genuine We've made some breakthroughs in that area, building SMRs. These are bipartisan issues, I think, and so as a consequence, you've seen really important legislation that came up. I talked about permitting. That also applies to the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And so there have been policy changes there with hopes that we can sort of improve the process that it takes to get a combined operating license, to get the health and safety standards established. You know, the rest of the world actually looks to the standards set by the NRC when they look to embrace SMR technology or existing nuclear technology. There's a lot of excitement overseas about AP1000 to be built. I learned this morning of the genuine enthusiasm and plans that we can build in the United States additional AP1000s. I had the pleasure and privilege to go to the Vogtle inauguration ceremony along with Secretary Granholm, former Secretary Ernie Moniz, former Secretary Dan Bruyette, a couple of former deputy secretaries. You know, this has taken decades to get that AP1000 built, but it was a celebratory event. It was truly celebratory, and it was bipartisan, and I think that we were able to really celebrate American ingenuity and, frankly, commitment to build this plant, and without it, we wouldn't be having this discussion about the enthusiasm of SMRs and potential fusion, you know, and again, more AP1000s.
We have some questions from the audience. My colleague Lisa will read them off. She has a couple.
Chris McNair asked, how are the industry inclusion efforts coming along for public-private partnerships?
Public-private partnerships.
Right. Are we talking about like a DOE, Department of Energy, public-private partnerships? Right. Well, there's been a huge effort to develop that. That is a hallmark of how Department of Energy operates, and I think that there have been many efforts. Anybody who talks to Chiga Shah in the LPO office or any of the heads of any of those agencies over there, they talk about public-private partnerships. That has been a tried and proven method of advancing technologies and getting capital to invest in projects and get the department or the government to really take the technological risk. Which is, I think, the important role for a government to play. So you enable the finance to move if the government can take the technological risk, it seems to me. So I think they're kind of racing, if you will, to try to formalize things and get it out. You know, somebody said we're in an election year. So, you know, your last year of potential last year of your first presidential term, you tend to try to push things forward. So I think you're seeing things come out there.
Wait, one more?
You touched on this a little bit already, but Martin Perlmutter asked if we could elaborate. How do you change the climate of public opinion on nuclear energy? Yeah,
so, you know, and Maria will come behind me, and I think she'll tell you, but when I was at the department, nuclear was very important. We had a lot of enthusiasm for nuclear, and our motto, or we came up with this. We wanted to make cool nuclear. I mean, we wanted to make nuclear cool again, as in cool, hip, and global. We have excellent centers of excellence around at the universities. We were going around trying to engender true enthusiasm for engineers to go into nuclear, that there was a bright future for nuclear. And with the emissions story, IEA, back in 2019, I think, wrote a report that says if you are serious in reducing global emissions and providing independent energy to countries, all countries should be looking at investing in nuclear now. While it's capital intensive, you have to understand that these, and I'm sure everybody in this room understands this, but maybe there's somebody out there watching, you know, the investment today, these nuclear facilities have operating licenses 20, 40 years, and they can be renewed. And so for what you're investing in nuclear today, think about this, 60 years from now, maybe even 80 years from now, they are still operating, and imagine the cost coming down, and it's all emission-free. And with the safety developments today, the new technologies that don't use, you know, light water reactor or pressure water reactors, you know, the molten salts, the pebble bed reactors, et cetera, you literally are having walk-away safe potential nuclear. You have improvements in the accident-tolerant fuels, for example. So safety is only going up, not going down, in my opinion. And so there's a real genuine enthusiasm for that.
You mentioned it's an election year, 96 days to go. And if you look at, thinking back to the 2000 election, a lot of the analysis back then was, well, with Bush or Gore, it really is not going to matter that much. Their policies are very the same. And whether that was true or not, but now moving forward, since then, radically different views of energy. You were a Trump appointee, got 79 votes in the Senate, very impressive. But what would the election mean for the future of energy and nuclear in both directions?
Yeah, well, I mean, the good news is, both recognize the importance of energy, first of all. So there will be a lot of efforts to make sure that we continue to provide affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy everywhere. I think the biggest difference is probably the recognition that geopolitics has changed in large part because of the shale revolution, which allowed certain states to proceed with hydraulic fracturing, and we had cheap abundance natural gas, and we could hydraulically frack oil. And so as a consequence of that, just since the 2005 Act, for example, when those issues were addressed, the U.S. has become the world's leading producer of oil and natural gas, the world's leading producer and the world's leading exporter of natural gas. Now that has really changed geopolitics, okay? So a Trump administration will likely recognize that. It's not that the current administration doesn't, but the importance of having the U.S. maintain that position. Now, I think both recognize the importance of emission reductions, and there's a lot of technology about carbon capture, technology, carbon capture storage, and direct air capture. There's, increased efficiencies in industrial technologies, et cetera. But I think that's going to be the key. You'll just see barriers removed to that development. But it's not to say there won't be continued efforts to have, emissions being reduced. And so in the climate world, it's emissions that cause climate. It's not really the fuel you use. So if we can get a hand on the emission reductions, and the U.S., by the way, has shown that it can. We can grow and we can reduce. I go around the world telling people you should emulate the United States and its policies if you want to have a vibrant energy industry and yet reduce emissions. You can do that. Now, again, you brought up China. A lot of what we do is offset by what China does and India to another extent. But I think we have the opportunities, to get in there and really help drive down emissions. So I think the policies will be a lot like they were in the past Trump administration, and I think those would, if he gets elected, I think you'll see a lot of that.
Last question, you mentioned the demand for energy and electricity, AI, of course. Where are we headed with the future of nuclear over the next 5 to 10 years? And where would you like the industry to be?
Yeah, well, of course, when you think of nuclear, you think the power sector, right? I mean, energy is also in transportation and industrial sectors. But that thermal heat that nukes provide, think about, the future hydrogen economy, for example, right? I mean, in the IRA, you have the first time 45V, clean hydrogen tax credit. Nuclear can, produce emission-free power that, we hope can, be used to produce hydrogen. So when you think globally and other opportunities for nuclear, the future is very bright.
Well, we've run out of time. Please thank Mark Menezes for joining us this morning. Thanks so much, Mark. I appreciate it.